The journey of a civilization is a history of contradictions, of dualities which burn and consume one another within our cultures, our religions, and our lives. The contradictions of love and power, of individuality and community, of ideality and actuality. This video is going to be about those contradictions and the strategies which have been devised in order to navigate these conflicts which grind away within the soul of what we often refer to as Western civilization. On the surface, this video is going to address the ideologies of capitalism and Marxism. But beneath that veneer, I'm going to try to begin telling a story that I think is much further reaching. Unfortunately, this isn't a story that can begin at the actual beginning, so instead I'm going to try for the second best option. For now, we will begin with the 17th century British philosopher, John Locke. Locke is considered to be one of the most significant founders of a kind of political philosophy which we now know as liberalism. Liberalism, put very simply, amounts to the notion that human beings are fundamentally individuals, who then come together so as to agree on what sort of society they wish to create with one another. Society then is seen as ideally being the result of a rational agreement between free individuals, whose individual wills are balanced by one another, mediated by what we could call a social contract. John Locke was a man who lived within a kind of threshold between the dying world of medieval Christendom and a life world which had yet to be born, one which, in my opinion, has still yet to be born. But along with Locke's social theory came another idea which would be equally formative in the shaping of the world of transitions we call modernity. This was the idea of private property. Private property is a concept which is so central to the modern world that it seems to hardly need any explanation at all, and yet we must remind ourselves that this notion is not simply a given. In the world of medieval Christendom, the idea of private property rights was simply non-existent. There were certainly laws against stealing other people's possessions, and the monarch was considered to wield dominion over his lands and all of the material resources of those lands. Nevertheless, Christendom was a world in which law was first and foremost rooted in religious doctrine. And medieval Christians actually saw that Christian doctrine demanded restraint of private property, laws against usury, for example, rather than guarantees of personal dominion over particular objects or plots of land. Yet Locke was living in a world in which the structures of power, which characterized the Middle Ages, were rapidly shifting. The Protestant Reformation had torn Christendom asunder and consequently resulted in the laxing of prohibitions on usury, which had prevented mass accumulation of wealth by non-state financiers. The New World had also come into view, and the Age of Sail brought with it opportunities for prosperity and wealth which were entirely unknown to medieval Europe. The world seemed to be open for the taking, but to justify the exploitation of these opportunities would require a drastic reformulation of the social doctrines which had woven together Christendom for the past 1,000 years. As was only natural for a man of his time, John Locke looked to the Bible, specifically passages within Genesis, which were taken to imply that human beings, in some sense, owned their own bodies. Extrapolating from this, Locke formed his theological argument for private property. Human beings own their bodies and thus own what their bodies do. A person owns their own labor, as it were, and thus it could be said that a person also owns the products of their labor as well. A tree sitting in the forest belongs to no one in particular, but if I go and chop the tree down and carve it into a coffee table, then I own that coffee table. Specifically, I own the table because the labor which I contributed to the table is now constitutive of the essence of the table. My labor is now a fundamental part of what makes the table what it is, and thus, by owning my own labor, I also, by extension, own the table. Now, this might seem to us like a rather convoluted argument, but it serves to highlight just how non-obvious the idea of private property was only a few centuries ago. A table sitting in the cottage of a medieval peasant family was an object which belonged to a family, not a person, and if the king decided that he really needed that table, then that family would find themselves with one less table. Yet the most significant philosophical move made by John Locke was the extension of this notion of private property into the realm of money. Locke argued that private ownership of money was justified because money could serve as a kind of store of labor value. In other words, if I make my table and then sell it to you, then the money I have serves as a kind of metaphysical signifier of the value which went into the creation of the table. In a sense, I no longer own the table, but I own the value of the table, which is now contained within the money. It's very easy to overlook just how esoteric and metaphysically dense the idea of money actually is, until we begin to put the idea under the microscope in this way. At this point, this is where most commentators would declare the ideological birth of capitalism. We now have private property and monetary exchange, after all, and thus it would seem that we have all of the necessary requirements for what we now oftentimes call the free market. But if we think about this for just a moment, I think it becomes clear that something here doesn't quite add up. Markets existed in the Middle Ages. The Roman Empire printed coins. In fact, some of the oldest written records ever discovered by archaeologists are in fact ledgers, which document financial transactions. So why didn't the birth of capitalism occur in ancient Mesopotamia rather than 17th century Western Europe? Now, if we really wanted to get into the weeds of this question and look at the dynamics of culture, economics, population growth, and political sovereignty, then this would be an immensely complicated question to answer. But for now, I'm going to be glossing over all of that in order to make a much simpler point. Despite the fact that it continues to be repeated ad nauseum, the reality is that capitalism is not equivalent to free markets. The essence of capitalism is not the exchange of goods and services mediated by monetary transactions. All of those things existed for thousands of years prior to the birth of capitalism. The reality then is that John Locke's labor theory of private property was in fact only the last piece of a puzzle which had been in the process of assembly since at least the Italian Renaissance. The central piece of the puzzle, that is capitalism, is not the labor theory of property. Rather, it is the institution of banking. Banking allows for something which, for most of human history, virtually all sovereign states and religious doctrines have sought to prevent. The practice of manipulating the esoteric, metaphysical structure of money so as to create more money. Following the origins of banking in the Italian Renaissance, banking institutions and the correlative practices of lending and investment came to spread like wildfire throughout Europe, and it was specifically these practices which allowed the kings, conquistadors, and entrepreneurs of Western Europe to garner the funds needed to set out upon their quests to conquer the world. either by muskets and blades or by silks and spices. John Locke's formulation of private ownership was ultimately a kind of ad hoc, ideological justification which was intended to legitimize political and cultural transformations which were already well underway during the 17th century. The birth of banking brought about the birth of investment capitalism, which would in turn ultimately give rise to the Industrial Revolution. The consequences of these transformations for the history of human civilization and for the destiny of life on this planet cannot be overstated. Yet here I want to focus primarily on the metaphysical consequences of this transformation for the world of Christendom, as it is those consequences which I see as above all the most monumental. We must keep in mind that this transformation is one which emerged within the world of Christendom, a world which was transmuted in almost every single aspect of life for well over 1,000 years by the ideals of Christianity. Here we must take account of what exactly that implies. In particular, I want to emphasize that the world of Christendom cannot be understood unless we understand how Christianity came to define itself in contrast to the Roman Empire. Within the canonical Christian Gospels, we see innumerable references to Rome. The word legion, an obvious gesture to the Roman military, was used in the Gospels to refer to a kind of collective demonic spirit. The phrase, render unto Caesar that which is of Caesar, indicates a disavowal of Roman political power and in particular the financial aspect of that power. Ultimately, Jesus himself is executed by ministers of the Roman Empire, and in the Apocalypse of John, we also see various indications that early Christians saw their great adversary, the great spirit of evil which would come to unravel the earth itself, as being the spirit of Rome. The titanic structures of coercive domination, wealth, and violence which shaped the Roman world and which John of Patmos envisioned to eventually reshape the world yet again within the great climax at the end of time. And yet, as Christianity came to predominance within the Western world and thus began to reshape the very fabric of that world, the spirit of Rome yet remained. The Byzantine Empire carried on the legacy of Rome in the East, while the Carolingian Empire continued that same legacy in the West, later to become known as the Holy Roman Empire. The world of Christendom was thus, in a sense, an attempt at a sort of compromise between the ideals of Christianity and the lingering, undead spirit of Rome herself. This compromise was the institution of Christian monarchism. In Western Christianity, kings were legitimized by the Bishop of Rome. The king's authority was said to derive from his appointment by God, meaning that the king was expected to rule in accordance with the realization and preservation of Christian ideals. Communities of ordinary people bound together by mutual responsibility, faith, and the universality of the sanctity of human life. Though Christian monarchs wielded power in a similar manner as that of Roman emperors, those monarchs were, at least in principle, bound by moral ideals which greatly limited the legitimacy of such power. Looking once more to Locke's theological arguments for private ownership, we can see this idea as yet another means by which Christianity was brought forth within the Christian world to impose limitations upon the legitimate uses of political authority. If my ownership of my money is guaranteed by the Bible, then that restricts the power of the king to tell me what I can do with that money. And yet through this very affirmation of private property rights, we can see the collapse of the great compromise between personal power and Christian ideals which prevailed during the Middle Ages. Whereas the monarchs and nobility of the medieval period were bound by a religiously codified duty towards the people of their dominion, the birth of capitalism would signal the rise of a new oligarchic class which would be burdened by no such limitation and no such religious obligations. Just as Roman senators and emperors were individuals who achieved their power through violence and exploitation, capitalist investors would likewise come to achieve elite status through the accumulation of personal power in the form of capital itself. A corporate CEO in the modern world wields at least as much social and political power as most medieval monarchs, yet the CEO is not crowned by a religious leader, nor bound by a religious oath to realizing and sustaining the ideals of Christian solidarity. The CEO is crowned by investors. He achieves his status because he is considered to be competent in the esoteric art of transmuting financial power into more financial power. His obligation is not to the Christian ideal of the flourishing of ordinary human life. His obligation is to his company's investors, and their interest in his rulership is exclusively in terms of the creation and maintenance of financial power. In the next section, we are going to talk about Marxism and the ways in which Marxism is, just like capitalism, a result of the deformation of Christian ideals. First, however, I want to say a few more things about capitalism itself and the ways in which capitalism has proven to be an immeasurably caustic force with regards to both the spiritual and ecological vitality of human life. The arguments which I will put forward here are not leftist or progressive arguments, nor are these arguments rooted in any particular religious framework. These are arguments which presume that the most politically significant aspect of human life is the manner in which we are inextricably woven within socio-ecological fabrics which condition the possibility of human psychological and physiological flourishing. Capitalism is a system in which market dynamics come to be the central guiding force in shaping the social evolution of a society. Ideally, we might like to think that individual human communities should be able to exercise collective agency in determining what their culture actually looks like. If we see a practice which is obviously destructive, we should be able to simply decide not to do whatever that destructive thing is. Yet, within capitalism, this proves to be almost the exact opposite of what we actually find to be the case. Foods which are oversaturated with sugars and high fructose corn syrups are undeniably very bad for general public health. Any sane community would simply decide not to eat such foods. Yet such foods simply sell more and thus make more money, specifically because they appeal to the more self-destructive aspects of human nature. One company begins selling such products and they succeed financially. In order to compete, similar companies will adjust their menus in accordance. Very soon, we find a food economy in which the most cheap and readily available foods are precisely the foods which we should not be eating, and as such, even individuals who normally would not eat those foods will do so anyway, simply as a matter of convenience. Despite the fact that the capitalist market is often compared to democracy, the reality is that the market is more like a perverse parody of democracy, in which collective behavior results in societal decisions being made that no one would have ever agreed to if the options were actually presented to them. No one decided that they wanted to live in a world in which toddlers stare at screens for dozens of hours a week. No one decided to create a world in which no one knows their neighbors by name. No one decided that it was a good idea to allow pharmaceutical executives to become billionaires at the expense of an opioid epidemic which claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. None of us chose to create such a world. The market decided to create such a world, because the market simply does whatever it has to do in order to transmute money into more money. Human beings require cohesive families, communities, and cultures in order to consistently thrive. Capitalism, however, actively brings about social transformations which result in human beings becoming ever more isolated, ever more alienated from each other and from the natural world, ever more mentally unwell and thus dependent upon the medical-industrial complex, ever more desperate to realize narcissistic fantasies which we are led to believe will heal our sense of incompleteness. The more dysfunctional, confused, and isolated we become, the more profitable we become. When the social and economic transformations that amplify our crisis of spirit result in economic growth, those changes are here to stay. Likewise, capitalism also disentangles socio-political power from the moral values which allow for societal cohesion. A medieval knight or samurai was expected to uphold a certain moral code. They were individuals who were expected to fight and die with honor and dignity. Ministers of the ancient and medieval Chinese bureaucracies were appointed by the emperor on the basis of education, merit, and moral discernment. Within such societies, there was a very clear and concerted effort to maintain a tight correspondence between the constitutive values of the society and social status. Within capitalism, social status is almost entirely a matter of wealth. Capitalism rewards those who are cunning, manipulative, calculating, morally unfettered, or egotistical. Unlike those who were born into medieval nobility, those who are born into extravagant wealth in the modern world are bound by nothing but their own desires. And such unbounded power fantasies, more often than not, come to mutate into some version of hell. Finally, capitalism is a system which is inextricably dependent upon indefinite growth. Due to the nature of the capitalist monetary system, capitalist economies can never simply produce enough stuff to meet the needs of a people. We in the so-called developed world have been producing far more than we could ever possibly need for many decades. Yet an enormous amount of what is produced is simply thrown away, including over 1/3 of all food produced in the United States. Likewise, that which is produced and consumed is designed in advance to become obsolete in short order. Cars, phones, and computers are not built to last. They are built to break or become outmoded within a given time frame, as this allows for a continuing renewal of market demand. Within modern capitalism, money is essentially lent into existence at interest, meaning that there will always be far more debt in a given economy than the actual supply of money. If people pay off all their debts without taking out new loans in order to replenish the money supply, then eventually there will simply no longer be any money, and yet there will still be debt. Economic growth must therefore be promoted at all costs, whether that be through war, the further destruction of the natural environment, or whatever means are necessary. No matter how much is produced, there will never be enough. There is no such thing as enough. Yet we live on a finite planet with finite resources. Infinite growth is simply not an option in the grand scheme of things. Techno-oligarchs have recently begun fantasizing about taking capitalism to outer space to mine the resources of the moon or of the asteroid belt. And guys, I really cannot emphasize this enough, but we do not need to mine friggin' asteroids or the moon. We have everything, and far, far more than we could ever possibly need here on Earth. What we need is a way of living in which enough is actually an option. When we look at the world around us in the modern age, what we see is not a world created by human beings, but a world created by a great blind machine. The machine does not know who you are. It does not care what kinds of suffering it creates. It does not know what suffering is. The machine simply feeds. It devours the world and transmutes the world into capital. It is a beast comprised of money and blood, and it is everywhere, for it is legion. Whereas the ideology of liberal capitalism emerged within a Western Europe which remained predominantly Christian, the ideology of Marxism emerged from an academic, intellectual culture of the 19th century which was increasingly materialistic and atheistic in nature. Karl Marx saw his philosophy as a scientific socialism. It was to be a means of remaking the world in accordance with materialistic rationality. Fundamental to Marxist doctrine is the distinction between base and superstructure. Base here refers to the material conditions of a given socio-economic life world. It is the metabolism of material relations between human beings and between the human society and its natural environment. The different forms of this base are referred to as modes of production. As the term base indicates, Marxists see the material mode of production as the fundamental ground of a given culture. It is the means by which human life is able to sustain and perpetuate itself, and thus is seen to be the core from which all other aspects of human existence come to emerge. These secondary aspects, such as religious practices, societal norms, moral values, political institutions, and traditions of art, literature, and music, are all considered to be a superstructure, which grows out from a society's underlying material conditions. Marxists, therefore, regard the superstructure as something which can and should be entirely reconfigured through the transformation of the society's material conditions. Conversely, this transformation of culture can serve as a means to achieve the goal of remaking the material base. Marxists do not believe that there is an underlying metaphysical structure to the world which conditions the nature of art, music, culture, religion, and morality. These aspects of human life are seen as secondary and entirely dependent outgrowths of material conditions. As such, Marxists regard culture entirely in light of the ultimate goal of achieving communism. Cultural norms are often seen simply as obstacles to that ultimate final telos. Conversely, when Marxists actually create culture or think in moral terms, they see their activity as conditioned and informed by the teleology of communism. Art should reinforce communist ideology. Narrative should further the mythos of the triumph of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie. Any sort of traditionalism or any sort of moral or aesthetic thought which defers to a higher order of reality is seen as fundamentally reactionary. Marxists do not believe that there is such a higher order, and therefore any cultural activity which is not directly in service of the realization of communism can only be a product of a different mode of production, either of capitalism or as a vestige of the feudal past. Within Marxist ideology, the goal of achieving communism effectively fills the same role which, during the medieval period, was performed by the concept of the will of God. The authority of the state is legitimized by its relation to the achievement of communism, and moral value is defined in relation to such achievement. Ironically, Marxism and capitalism are, in essence, both forms of hyper-liberalism. They both take the basic premises of liberalism formulated initially by John Locke and elaborate those premises in opposite directions. Within capitalist ideology, Locke's labor theory of property becomes elaborated so as to serve as a justification of power accumulation through usury. Within Marxism, conversely, the labor theory of property becomes elaborated so as to become the labor theory of value, which then serves as the basis for the Marxist conceptions of alienation and exploitation. Marx contends that the owners of the means of production are able to become wealthy through the vampiric extraction of surplus value. The laborer creates labor value through their work, and this value is then garnered by the owner of the means of production, such that the worker is only paid a small portion of the value which they actually created through their labor. What the owner takes off the top is thus a surplus value, which Marx saw as a form of unjust exploitation. Given that Marxism is a metaphysically materialistic doctrine, it would appear at first that Marx would have no basis by which to argue that such garnering of surplus value is morally unjust in any way. If Marxist morality is defined in relation to the goal of achieving communism, and communism is defined as an end of exploitation, then it would seem that we have a circular line of reasoning here. But Marx saw the immorality of such exploitation in terms of his manner of conceptualizing the ontological essence of human beings. Marx was, of course, a materialist, and therefore saw the essence of human existence as fundamentally material. Therefore, the material relations of human life, that is, our labor, can be seen as existentially constitutive of human life. In other words, our labor is part of who and what we are, metaphysically. Marx saw the extraction of surplus value as a means by which human beings come to be alienated from their labor. Alienated labor is labor which effectively belongs to someone else, and therefore this creates a kind of rupture within the material essence of human existence. Capitalist exploitation, therefore, could be seen as a process by which human beings become essentially denatured. The alienation of our labor leaves us incomplete, emptied of a fundamental aspect of what makes us human. It is here then that we can see just how Marxism is in fact a form of hyper-liberal ideology. It begins with individual self-ownership in the exact same way that we see in capitalist ideology. Despite the supposedly collectivist ideals of Marxism, we can see that Marxism begins with a fundamentally individualistic conception of human existence. The ideal of communism is understood to be a state in which the human individual is re-familiarized with the labor which had previously been robbed of him unjustly. Although the ideal of Marxism appears superficially to resemble the ideals of Christianity, beneath the surface we can see that within Marxism there is no conception of fundamental human dignity, no conception of the sanctity of life, no conception of a fundamental obligation to the spiritual flourishing of other human beings. Marxist ideology is an attempt to derive a morality of collective solidarity from an essentially egotistic conception of human nature, just as liberal capitalism sees society as a kind of contract between actors who are first and foremost egoic individuals. Marxism likewise sees the self-sovereignty of the individual and his labor as fundamental, while seeing the social life world itself as merely a byproduct. Both ideologies are rooted in the metaphysical framework of the Cartesian egoic self. All of Marxist ideology must refer back to its core, to the ideal of reuniting the human ego with its labor. This fact, along with the Marxist view of morality and culture as being materially grounded, implies that Marxism is a moral framework within which anything can be justified by reference to the goal of achieving communism. War, cultural extermination, mass executions of civilian populations, the eradication of religious institutions, the censorship of artists and philosophers, all can and have been justified in the name of achieving communism, and yet communism itself remains conspicuously unachieved. Moreover, the Marxist vision of communism simply cannot be achieved, any more so than capitalism can ever produce enough to satisfy its endless demand for economic growth. The Marxist vision is unachievable because culture, the spiritual dimensions of human existence, does not simply grow out from relations of material production. It is unachievable because you do not own yourself or your labor. You belong to a family, a community, a culture, a language. Your labor belongs to the form of life which produced you, and which we all strive to sustain and perpetuate. Your body and labor belong to the earth, and to the life world which lives through you and through the earth. It is this very sense of belonging which both capitalism and Marxism annihilate, and it is here that we see the fundamental contradiction between these ideological frameworks and the reality of human existence. In order to move beyond these ideologies, and thus to move beyond the nightmares of the 20th century, and the nightmares of the modern consumerist hell world, we must be willing to think beyond the individual ego, beyond the merely material. We must reclaim our sense of human existence as constituted fundamentally by mutual obligation, higher purpose, and our grounding within a living, breathing reality. This is not a path that we can traverse by voting for the right politicians or by purchasing the correct products. I am not offering here a vision which can be achieved by winning any number of battles within culture wars or economic policies. To create a new world means to create a new mode of life, a new culture, a new way of thinking and relating to the world. We must be willing to reclaim the wisdoms of the past which have been buried by modernity, and we must be willing to imagine a future which has never before been actualized. Hypermodernity is a world in which human beings are the slaves of machines, while we must create instead is a world in which technology serves to further human life. Rather than simply watching the iron laws of economic and technological growth play themselves out, we must create a world in which we are able to decide for ourselves what technologies are actually beneficial to us and which are not. We must somehow develop means to ensure that those who wield power over us are those who most embody the ideals which allow for the realization of beauty within our lives. 15 centuries after its fall, we find that we are still contending with the spirit which gave shape to the Roman Empire, the incessant, bottomless hunger of the will to power. We are seeing the ways in which that spirit can come to deform and mutilate our world when it is able to wield the power to bend nature itself to its will. Now we are beginning to see what happens when that same power begins to act on human bodies through the fantasy that we can remake ourselves in whatever manner we see fit. The consequences of that fantasy are only going to get more and more horrific and disturbing, and that is something we must be prepared for. We must find ways of regenerating the cohesion with one another which we have lost along the way, and therefore we must remember the perennial truth that a people is necessarily bound together by a shared sense of spiritual purpose. But perhaps before that is even possible, we must first begin by regenerating the cohesion within our own minds and our own lives, such that we are able to germinate within ourselves the seeds of a future that we might not live to see. Obviously, we have to play with the hands which we are dealt, and I doubt any individual now has the power to correct the course we seem to be on. Nonetheless, there is immeasurable value in striving to become beacons of sanity in a world that is rapidly descending into madness, as that is itself the most basic condition for the possibility of finding our way out of the darkness.